So how can we increase our productivity? We take a look at our factors of production once again. So increasing productivity can come from these sources. So we're going to be breaking down each of our factors of production and see exactly which one is going to be the most important driver of economic growth. So increasing productivity can come from these sources. Can come from, number one, it can come from land/natural resources. Land/natural resources. So how important do you think land is in terms of inducing economic growth or increasing our productivity? You might think that it's going to be very, very important, but in economics, it's not as important as you may imagine. We consider land or natural resources to be the building blocks. The building blocks of production, but not a significant driver. So building blocks of production, but not a significant driver. Not a significant driver. And the reason why it's only seen as the building blocks and not very, very important is because the reasoning is twofold. Number one, land and natural resources are seen as finite. So the amount of minerals that we have in the land, amount of oil, natural gas, these are all things that are finite. We don't have an infinite amount of them. So therefore, there's going to be some type of upper limit to exactly how much productivity or how efficiently we can use these natural resources. Secondly, it depends, the value of land and natural resources does depend on our other factors of production. Suppose that you're sitting on top of a giant oil well, but you don't necessarily have the right tools to extract the oil from the land. Then that oil is basically seen as useless to you. So here, if you can't actually get usage or get the oil out of the land, then there's nothing that you can really do about it. You can't exploit it for your own purposes. So for these two reasons, we only see land or natural resources as being the building blocks of production and not a significant driver. The second factor of production that we can take a look at is, of course, going to be the labor force. So the labor force. And as we already discussed with our production function, this is probably the least important factor of production or resource we take a look at. It may lead to greater output, but not necessarily output per worker. But not necessarily output per worker, which is what we are interested in. Output per worker. So here, having a very large population may increase the amount of goods and services that we can actually produce, but not necessarily output per worker, which is a better measure of our efficiency and productivity. What is important when it comes in terms of the labor force is exactly the quality of the labor force. So quality of labor force. So the quality of the labor force refers to human capital. So exactly what does the labor force know how to do? Are they very smart? Do they have an education? What are their skills? Etc., etc. So the quality of the labor force is actually very, very important because the better educated workforce that we have, the more productive our people are going to be. And the quality of the labor force comes from investments in human capital. And human capital. And of course, human capital are just improvements in the labor force. Improvements in the labor force. In the labor force. And these improvements can come from a variety of sources. They can come from investments in skills, knowledge, education, the overall quality of the workers. So let's go ahead and just write this down so you have a clearer idea. So improvements in the labor force from investments in skills, knowledge, and education. So what you guys are doing right now, you're improving your human capital by getting a better education, by getting a better experience of exactly what economics is all about. And hopefully that will make you a little bit more of a productive worker down the line. So here, 3 resources so far. Land, natural resources, not too important. Labor force, not at all important. The quality of the labor force, very important. And then we come to the physical capital to labor ratio. So next is physical capital. And this is also going to be very important as well. We can consider this to be the physical capital to labor ratio. Capital to labor ratio. So here we don't want to confuse human capital with physical capital. So anytime we talk about the capital to labor ratio, it's going to deal with physical capital. And there is a way for us to take a look at the physical capital ratio. We simply have to divide. So physical capital divided by labor. Simply put, K divided by L. And we want to get this K divided by L as high as possible, because the higher this ratio is, the more productive our workers are going to be. So if we give workers more construction equipment, if we give more workers just equipment in general, wherever it may be, that is going to increase the capital to labor ratio, and our workers are going to be seen as a little bit more efficient. However, there are a few in-depth analyses that we want to talk about when we talk about the capital to labor ratio. So just moving through the slides right here, we have land, we have investment in human capital, we have the labor force, but with physical capital, we do want to note that there is going to be some type of upper limit to how high this capital to labor ratio can actually be. We say that capital is subject to diminishing returns, where every additional unit of capital increases output by a positive but smaller amount. And the capital to labor ratio is essentially the reason why so many countries around the world internationally are growing so fast nowadays. So countries in Africa and Asia, the reason why they have such a very rapid economic growth rate is because they actually have a relatively low capital to labor ratio starting off. So here, when we say that capital is subject to diminishing returns, it tells us that every piece of additional equipment or physical capital that you give to your workers, it is going to make them a little bit more efficient, but not as efficient as a previous piece of physical capital. So to see this example a little bit more clearly, suppose that I tell you just to stop this video right now and stop what you're doing and tell me, and I tell you guys to write me a paper about economics, and you're not allowed to use anything at all, just your brain, a piece of paper, and a pen. How productive do you think you would be under this situation? Honestly, you guys probably would not be productive at all, and you probably wouldn't give me a very good written economics paper, or you wouldn't be even able to maybe write me a paragraph in a very short amount of time. However, suppose that I give you a piece of physical capital. Suppose I now give you a computer, a laptop to work with. How productive do you think you would be in this case? You'd be very, very productive now. You can actually use the computer to research an economics topic. You can go ahead, take a look at other sort of things. You don't have to write your paper just on pen and paper anymore. You can actually use a word processor, which is much, much more faster. You can spell check and all of that. So if I give you that one piece of physical capital, you'd be very productive with that. However, suppose I give you an additional computer, so an additional piece of physical capital. Would you be even more productive now? You would be productive, but it wouldn't be as productive as the very first computer that I gave to you. The second computer, you could probably use it as like a dual monitor type of situation where you use one computer to research, use the other computer to go ahead and write your paper, but it wouldn't give you as much productivity as your very first computer. And what happens if I give you a third computer? You probably wouldn't even use that computer at all. So here, this is once again just the idea of capital, the physical capital, being subject to diminishing returns. So that tells us that in areas where there is a relatively low capital to labor ratio, they're going to be benefiting the most from an additional piece of capital. So countries like in Asia and also in countries in Africa, where in areas where we already have a high capital to labor ratio, like the United States, Canada, a lot of countries in Europe, by giving an additional piece of physical capital there, it is going to increase output, but it's not going to make us very, very productive. And we can see this with a simple example with this in terms of farming. So in Bhutan, a very small country in Asia, farmers use yaks to plow their fields, which is a very labor-intensive production method. If we give this one farmer, however, say a big tractor, he's going to be very, very productive. He can probably plow all of his fields in one day. If we take a look in Iowa, however, farmers already use expensive tractors to plow their fields, a very capital-intensive production method. If we give this one farmer an additional tractor, he'll be productive, but not as productive as before because we have a very high capital to labor ratio in this instance. And because there are differences between capital to labor ratios between developed and developing countries, we do have an economic term which is known as the catch-up effect. So the catch-up effect describes why developing countries may initially grow faster than developed countries, why these developing countries abroad have very high economic growth rates today. So once again, countries in Asia and Africa compared to the developed countries, the United States, Canada, and countries in Europe. And this catch-up effect, as it's sort of known in the academic circle as convergence, both conditional convergence and absolute convergence, it basically says that these developing countries should catch up to the developed countries if they are able to sort of get more and more pieces of physical capital. So developing countries can use existing technologies to make their inputs more productive, while developed countries have to innovate in order to increase growth, which is going to be a very, very difficult task for any one country can do. So essentially, there is some type of second mover advantage with the catch-up effect. So developing countries can use existing technologies. They don't have to pour all their resources to making new inventions and sort of production processes. They can basically just use what is already available to them. And we can see this with, say, the high-speed rail system. What countries were the first to develop the high-speed rail system? They were Japan and France and Germany, essentially. But who came along after that to basically take that technology for themselves? It was China, of course, and now China basically has one of the most complex high-speed rail systems in the entire world. And they didn't necessarily need to go ahead and make this technology because it was already developed for them. One thing to note about this catch-up effect, however, is that it is still subject to these diminishing returns to capital. So here, these developing countries, they cannot just keep on increasing the amount of capital that they have on hand in order to keep on growing fast. There is going to be some type of upper limit before they actually see their growth rates falling as a result. So this is one of the main reasons why China nowadays has a relatively low growth rate compared to what it was 30 to 40 years ago. So before, it had a very low capital to labor ratio, but as they increased the amount of capital that they have relative to labor, that just tells us that, hey, they're going to be growing very fast, but they've sort of reached this upper limit right now. So before, they had the double-digit economic growth rates, but now this is exactly why they're growing roughly about 5 to 6% today. So something to keep in mind with the capital to labor ratio, very important initially in terms of inducing economic growth, but even every additional piece that we add to the ratio, it becomes less and less important. Finally, the last factor of production that we can take a look at are improvements in technology and new ideas which lead to economic growth. And as you guys already suspect, this is the main driver of economic growth nowadays for any country. So here we take a look at new ideas and technology. New ideas and technology. So essentially this A component. So new ideas and technology, as we've said, this plays the major role in improving productivity, and economic growth, So here, this is the main driver of economic growth, and this comes from new ideas and technology and even new processes as well. So what do you think are a few examples of new ideas and new technology or new processes? So let's go ahead and write down a few examples. So one that might pop up into your head is, hey, what about Henry Ford with the assembly line? So the assembly line essentially transformed the automobile industry. It made these very expensive automobiles and cars vastly available to the public at a relatively low price. With this assembly line, it essentially induces economic growth because cars, automobiles are going to make our lives very easier. It's going to improve the standard of living. So here, an assembly line is a perfect example of new ideas and technology. We can say, what about robots? What about the internet? The internet and computers. Automation just in general. So these are all examples of new ideas and technology playing a role in improving the standard of living abroad. And this is essentially going to be the most important driver of economic growth. With this new ideas and technology, this A component, there is a special name that we give to it, which is known as total factor productivity. So total factor productivity just says that if we cannot place this particular sort of idea into land, labor, physical capital, human capital, or into any one of our other factors of production, it is immediately going to fall in terms of total factor productivity or technology. It measures the portion of output that is not explained by the amount of inputs used, and it captures the external effects of influencing productivity of all inputs. And total factor productivity, in this case, it can be both positive and negative shocks depending on the example or situation that we find ourselves in. It includes factors such as natural disasters, which is obviously going to be a negative shock to our technology or total factor productivity. So hurricanes, earthquakes, volcanoes, global warming, basically just the destruction of Earth, it is going to be seen as a negative shock to total factor productivity. New discoveries and innovations, as we've already noticed, so the assembly line, computers, robots, automation, this is going to be a positive shock to total factor productivity. And changes to a country's institutions. This could be either positive or negative. If a country becomes more democratic, that'll be a positive shock. And if a country becomes more dictatorial or more authoritarian, then that's going to be a negative shock. So here, total factor productivity, once again, just a very fancy way of saying, hey, technology, ideas, entrepreneurship, if we cannot place it into one of our other factors of production, it's immediately going to fall under this resource right here. So as we talked about these resources in this particular section, we do note that there are some variables, some resources that are more valuable than others. Most importantly, total factor productivity, human capital, and physical capital, while others aren't as important, such as labor and land. So in the next section, we'll go ahead and talk a little bit more about the government and seeing the ways and the policies that they can enact in order to induce productivity and economic growth in order to improve the standard of living for the citizens of their country. I'll see you guys there.